Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be with all of you. We have traversed the month and arrived at our last episode of A Good Tree, part of the Cambridge Muslim College's Sow a Seed Ramadan Live program. Moving from seeding to cultivating to nurturing, we've had the privilege of learning from top scholars about various aspects of the Islamic tradition. And in this final week, we examine the theme of harvesting with a look at ecological theology and how Muslims have thought about the world, their place in it, and their relationship to other parts of creation and the natural world. Something that has fascinated scholars of Islam is how the Quran speaks about, to, and from the point of view of the natural world. In these formulations, human beings are of nature, of course, but also hold a unique position of being able to use, benefit, take from, till, and harvest from the natural world. In human history and Muslim history specifically, we see manifold examples of how people have interpreted this God-given permission to harvest within a spectrum, balance and harmony to largesse and excess. In a sense, this theme of harvesting is a fortuitous ending point for our series as it takes us right back to the heart of Muslim cosmology, or our origin story, as who we are is so deeply intertwined with who we are in relation to the world. Here to navigate us through these questions of harvesting is Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad. Shaykh Abdal Hakim is the founder and dean of the Cambridge Muslim College, as well as the Sheikh Zayed Lecturer of Islamic Studies in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. He's the author of numerous works, including translations of Imam al-Ghazali's books, as well as the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Islamic Theology. His discussion of animals in the Quran was also recently published in the Routledge Handbook of Religion and Animal Protection. His most recent book, Traveling Home, Essays on Islam in Europe, takes on some of the most pressing and pessimistic areas of current discourse and infuses them with a compassion-based approach full of hope and healing. Shaykh Abdal Hakim, a warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for coming to talk with us today.
Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to it.
So tonight we're talking about aspects of harvesting in the Islamic tradition. And it strikes me that up until very recently, the harvest has played a huge role in human civilization and seasonal living. Thinking about harvesting calls to mind numerous rites and rituals across cultures, really. Can you tell us a little bit about what the harvest and harvesting has meant for human beings and what it has symbolized?
Well, perhaps one of the thousands of enigmas about the Quran is that it does use the metaphor of harvesting quite frequently. Right at the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, we're told that the people of success, that's the usual translation, are the muflihun. Muflihun literally means the harvesters. Falaha in Arabic means agriculture. It's the usual word for agriculture. So we have this interesting paradox whereby the Quran, which emerges from this desert and from the city, which is described as Wadin Ghairi Dhi Zara, a valley with no cultivation. The valley of Mecca is famously arid and lifeless. That from that almost moonscape type environment, you have the rich and luxuriant use of various conjurations with the natural world, with the exuberance of new growth, and particularly with the idea of harvesting. One can understand that there is plenty about the wildlife that's evident in the Arabian desert, the camels in particular, the cattle, the horses. One can understand the language of the land coming to life again following rainstorms. But settled agriculture was not what the Western Arabs did, apart from a few oases, Medina, for instance, and some of the oases in Khaybar, Wadi al-Qura, and so forth. But we do have this very striking use of this term. And of course, the symbolism is very evident. The Quran, in its characteristically primordial way, strikes similitudes that are sort of immediate and universal. And this idea of this world as being some kind of sowing ground for the next is present in a number of hadiths. Ad-dunya mazra'atul akhirah. This world is the sowing ground or the the place where you sow seeds for the next world, indicating that the reality of what we do, and even our reality as human beings, only really comes about in the next world. And in this world, we're seeing things, as it were, through a glass darkly. So this very life-oriented imagery of this world as being a context where we prepare things for future growth, and of course enjoying them in this world as well, because you enjoy plants before they're harvested as well, the sheer beauty of them, and that's an indication of the beauty that is of the religious life. But the real outcome, tasting the fruits of it, is something that is left to the akhirah, in this wonderful, rich and luxuriant imagery that we have of the gardens of paradise, which is where we taste the fruit through God's grace, not through our own hard work of the efforts and the intentions that we've had in this world.
The Quran speaks of harvest in different contexts, as you mentioned. One aspect that comes to mind in our present discussion is the concept of taskhir. I think sometimes it's translated as kind of subjugation. For instance, in Surah 43, Zukhruf, verse 13, dua that many Muslims memorize for travel, the word sakhara is used.
Yes.
Glory be to him who has given us control over this. We could not have done it by ourselves. Can you help us better understand some of the Islamic ways of speaking about using or harvesting and the position of the human being in the world?
Yes, I think that one of the reparative aspects of the Quranic intervention in world religious history is that a certain pessimism or dualism had crept in, particularly in the context of the doctrines of some forms of late Hellenism, but also some of the Syriac Christian churches at the time, which tended to be very world denying, and proposed that the world and the phenomenon of life itself is something transient and, as it were, heavily weighted, which drags us down. And that intensified form of asceticism, which sometimes manifested itself in celibacy, for instance, seems to be roundly rejected by the Quran, with its insistence on the sacrality of life and living things. It is striking that there's essentially nothing about animals, for instance, in the New Testament, apart from the episode of the Gadarene swine, which is perhaps certainly not a very pro-pig story. Jesus casts out evil spirits into the bodies of pigs, and then the pigs jump off a cliff. But otherwise, you miss in the New Testament and in subsequent Christian reflection, I think, in many cases, this very extraordinary Quranic emphasis on the animals, and particularly the hadith and the Holy Prophet's relationship to animals, his mysterious communication with animals, his insistence on kindness to animals, even the Quranic verse that says that the animals and the birds are umamun amthalukum, nations like unto yourselves, which is an extraordinary thing to say, really, about creatures that superficially are emphatically not like ourselves. I'm not like the birds and my cat and a donkey. I am different. I can speak, I can think, I can have a moral life, I can have abstract thoughts in my head. But the Quran says that those species are umamun amthalukum, nations like yourselves. So if you look at the books of tafsir, you can see some very interesting conjurings with the fact that even though those other nations do not have our capacity for reason or for moral inference, they nonetheless receive revelation, and they are not morally accountable, but nonetheless in their nature, they are giving praise to God. They're in the state of ubudiyya. And that the sounds that they make are simply their own voicing of the praise of the divine. And this is one of the new things, I think, about the Quranic dispensation, that drawing the line under a rather shadowy and pessimistic view of the animal world, the natural world, the seasons, the body, the needs of the body, reproduction, that the Quran comes with something that's very life-affirming. And this is why, for instance, you have people like Herder and Nietzsche saying that Islam is paradigmatically a Dionysian rather than an Apollonian religion. They make that distinction. Christianity about transcendence, asceticism, moving beyond, leaving the normal cycles of animal life behind, as we saw into the Empyrean through asceticism and monastic vows, whereas Islam seeks very much to recognize the sacrality that is in the living world. So we get to God through life rather than transcending it. And this is what Nietzsche famously describes as Islam's Dionysian tendency, that we are in the world, we do marry. The Quran says that we should not forbid the tayyibat min al-rizq, the good things of provision. So it's more of a celebratory view of life, even though clearly it's also one that is disciplined and strongly devotional as well. And I think that's one of the watchwords of the Islamic religion that sets itself out as really a new departure in the history of monotheism.
This idea of going through it seems so difficult in some ways. I find that the most challenging part of dunya in a sense, but it's deeply connected to harvest, because as you watch a plant, the entire phase of a plant is mirroring that same process. I suppose from what you're saying, we can see this position of insan as a very privileged position. Can you talk about how the Islamic tradition also establishes responsibility that comes along with this privilege?
Yes, and this takes us back to the idea of taskhir, because many of the creatures on the earth are there for us to benefit from in certain material ways. We can eat them, most obviously, we can ride them, we can enjoy the aesthetics of their presence. The horses and the mules and the donkeys, we have made them so that you may ride them, and for beauty, because the Quran is very aestheticizing and helps us to configure ourselves with the divine harmony by perceiving the beauty that's in the natural world. But that capacity to use them, which is simply part of being a component of the web of creation, whereby certain species use other species and coexist according to a food chain, is not the same as exploitation. And this is where we have to look at the key doctrine of khilafah, that we are placed on this earth to be, as it were, sovereign under God over the earth, but in a manner that will bring about the well-being of the rest of the world, rather than, as in the case with our modernity, essentially parasitical upon it. The revival of the old Roman principle that regarding the earth and the animals and living things, one had jus utendi et abutendi, the right to use and to abuse, which is not present in the Sharia, but which is part of a certain enlightenment instrumentalizing of the natural world, the idea of engineering as being man's way of riding roughshod over the rights of the other species in order to ascend to some kind of earthly empyrean glory, with the results, of course, that we're now seeing in terms of climate change and environmental degradation. So, yes, man has a place of eminence over and amongst the other creatures, but in order to be, Khalifa really means God's representative, his vicegerent, as a good custodian of creation, rather than somebody who merely looks at the world as a set of resources to be used or abused. And I think that's particularly important. And Islam is very well placed, of course, to provide a rich and authentic theology in the midst of the climate change disaster, which is now threatening the entire world, but I think the Muslim world particularly.
This problem is going to get much worse, as we know, because humans are increasingly becoming more urban and less rural, and even more removed from the natural world. And this has multiple cascading effects on how we live with each other and live with the land. How can Muslims think about some of the things you're talking about here in these new contexts? Should we be thinking about reconnecting and reviving some of the concepts and ideas that you've mentioned and ways of living in our own present context?
Well, I think it's something that requires individual accountability, which begins with the Islamic respect for nature and also with a certain dislike for waste. The sunnah is, even if you're making wudu from a river, that you shouldn't use too much water. because waste is intrinsically a disharmony. But also, I think it has to be at the national level. And I think that the ulama and Muslims generally should be campaigning that the governments pay more attention to climate change, because the Muslim world is particularly threatened. I was just looking at the Pakistan government's policy on climate change, which is put together not by a group of Darul Uloom graduates, as you might expect, but by climate change scientists who are based in Islamabad. And the outlook is really extremely grim for Pakistan. They're predicting more and more extreme weather events. We already had those terrible floods a few years ago. The change in the monsoon pattern, the recession also of the Himalayan glaciers, the so-called third pole, the third ice cap, a third of which has been lost. The result being that the water that's being discharged into Pakistan's river systems, and also those of Bangladesh, of course, is becoming irregular rather than regular as it used to be, leading to all kinds of massive flooding and possibly even the depopulation of the river valleys by the middle of the 20th century, also leading to the buildup of silt in the major dams, and then rising temperatures, reduced agricultural productivity, deforestation, and also at the other end of Pakistan, the Indus Delta is becoming saline as a result of changes in sea levels and patterns of climate. So coastal agriculture is declining, the mangroves are dying in Pakistan. It is really a pretty ominous situation. That's just for Pakistan. But if you look across the Muslim world, you see that whereas some Western countries might not be frowning upon climate change, in 50 years' time, apparently I'll be able to grow lemons and oranges in my garden, which I guess my grandchildren will enjoy. But the Muslim world is located on that latitude strip of the world, which is particularly susceptible, where desertification is easy and potentially calamitous, where deltas such as the Nile Delta, the Brahmaputra Delta are already vulnerable. And it looks as if we're going to be seeing as one of the big new issues for the Ummah, massive population displacement and climate change refugees, adding to the refugees already streaming out of the Muslim world. So I think probably that this will be the largest source of refugee population displacement from the Muslim world in the next 50 years. And where they will go is, of course, the big question. There will be a few places where they're concentrated, rather as Jordan is a kind of concentration point for refugees. And at first, the British mismanagement in Palestine meant that the Palestinians went to Jordan, and then the British-American invasion of Iraq meant that 1 million Iraqis went to Jordan, and then an after effect of that was the catastrophe in Syria, which meant that 1 million Syrians went to Jordan. So it's a kind of stack, really, where people are piling up, and there are other stacks, for instance, areas of Bangladesh where refugees have come in from Myanmar. Gaza is another stack, some areas in southern Sudan where the Muslim population evacuated from the Central African Republic is staying. So this concentration of populations in small areas is going to impose very, very acute sort of population management issues, and of course may become the hotbed for who knows what forms of angry, extreme type of religion or aberrant behavior. And Europe is surrounding itself with razor wire and minefields. And as the population flows increase, not just from the Muslim world, but from places like sub-Saharan Africa as well, you're going to see a radically different culture, I think, as Europe increasingly forensically redefines its own internal ethics and makes sure that each time a new type of sexuality is discovered, that the government springs into action and that there are 1 million human rights protections for that orientation. But on the other hand, there will be a shadow side of Europe and also America regarding Latin America and places which are also producing floods of refugees, where everything looks very different and extremely unethical. So more and more people will be drowning in the Mediterranean. More people will be dying in the minefields of Greece. It's going to be extremely dangerous. So I think it's not just an individual matter of growing a garden and feeding yourself and looking after sheep in the mountains, the traditional responses, but really Muslims, insofar as they can, have to change the religious discourse in order to force the politicians to take more seriously the climate change threat, not just Muslim governments, but of course the world. The Biden administration is undoing some of the harm done by the Trump administration, but still what's required is 10 times more at least if carbon neutral objectives are to be met by the middle of the present century. So this is probably the largest single issue facing the Ummah at the moment, I would say. It's facing all of mankind, but I think the Muslim world is particularly in line for some catastrophes, and given the rather thin and ramshackle nature of the structures and civil society and government in so many Muslim countries, there is the possibility of mass death by the middle of the current century, and certainly massive disruption, breakdown in law and order. It is looking quite bad. But some Muslim countries are actually trying to make a difference. Not enough, but some of them are quite exemplary, actually. Whether or not they're using a religious discourse, but it's not as if the story is completely negative, because there are some stories of hope.
You have described, I think, in terrible detail, what the Anthropocene age, this age of our own human beings' own orchestrated destruction, what that looks like, and talk to us a little bit about the practical responsibilities that we'll all have. I wonder, Shaykh Abdal Hakim, if you can tell us a little bit about the spiritual responsibilities that we'll have, that we should be prepared for in the coming years, as a tradition which has always, a hallmark of the Islamic tradition has always been this being between fear and hope. I mean, so much of what I feel when we talk about this is a lot of fear. So what will be our spiritual responsibility of somehow being between fear and hope in these troubled times that we live in and that are coming?
Well, I think, yes, there should always be a balance between fear and hope. And the trust ultimately should be in not some kind of scientific miracle, because you can never have trust in science. Science isn't predictable that way. You can't say science will find a solution, because that's a very unscientific thing to say. Science doesn't work in that kind of prophetic way. But I think that we should be acting as religious communities, following a religious metabolism and set of priorities that are much more climate change oriented than is the case to date. It's still the case that in most Islamic universities, Darul Ulooms and so forth, that climate change is not really much on the agenda, even though we already have such a beautiful theology of religion and nature, and a spirituality that insists, as I say, on avoiding waste, and therefore not really joining wholeheartedly the current consumer madness, which is destroying the planet. But also, I think we need to green our institutions. So, I mean, you're familiar with the Cambridge Mosque, of course, which is an attempt to do that. But on a much larger scale, a number of initiatives. If you look at the proceedings of I think it was in 2015, the Istanbul International Islamic Climate Change Conference, where people, environmentalists and green theologians from around the Muslim world, had a chance to get together and compare notes. Actually, there's a lot of very interesting work going on, not so much from governments, but from civil society, religious institutions. So in Indonesia, for instance, both of the main Islamic organizations there, the Nahdlatul Ulama and the Muhammadiyah, have their own departments, their own staff for climate change issues, promoting green mosques. So in Indonesia, they're trying to add 1,000 new green mosques every year. It'll take 1,000 years, I guess, if they've got 1 million mosques, but at least it's a start. And the Nahdlatul Ulama, which is actually the world's largest Islamic organization with like 40 million members, has its own movement for forestry in the environment. The Mufti of Indonesia, Hozaima Yango, with her famous fatwa saying that it's a sin to light a fire in the forest, is a step forward. The Green Pesantren, the Green Madrasa initiative, it's hundreds of them now, where the idea is that it's actually not just strategically stupid for human beings to destroy the earth, but is actually sinful. So declaring this as one of the kaba'ir, really one of the mortal sins, extravagant waste, using lots of plastic, using fossil fuels should be seen actually as sinful. And there's an Indonesian who I've always found quite inspiring, Muhammad Masruri, who has a madrasa in Yogyakarta and CMC with a couple of years ago, who's really one of the pioneers on this and is very passionate and wants this to be at top of the khutbah agenda subsequently. Also in Indonesia, a lot of campaigning from the ulama against exploitation of new fossil fuel resources. There's a lot of lignite and coal resources in Kalimantan, which is southern Borneo, in the rainforest, and it would be an absolute catastrophe if the big corporations and the Indonesian government were to be allowed to do open cast mining there. That's the last thing we need. It destroys the ecosystem, and it also produces carbon gases. So yeah, Indonesia, there have been local initiatives which have been good. In Morocco, right at the other end of the Ummah, also, it's quite surprising that Morocco is more or less at the top of the international league table for preparedness for climate change. There's an annual performance index. I think it's called the Climate Change Performance Index, which ranks all the countries of the world according to how well they're doing. And Morocco last year was joint first, along with Sweden, which is interesting. It's not clear where they'll be this year because COVID has made energy consumption and everything rather unrepresentative. But to their credit, and actually working with Ahmed Tawfiq, who's the Minister of Awqaf there, a very kind of enlightened, devout person, they've been able to launch green mosque initiatives. So if you go to the Great Kutubiyya Mosque in Marrakesh, for instance, you'll see that the lights there are generated by photovoltaic arrays. And the massive use of renewables, 42% of Moroccan electricity now comes from renewables, which is about the highest in the world. 200 megawatt capacity for wind farms, because Morocco can be quite windy, but also an equivalent amount for solar thermal energy, because finally somebody's figured out a way of making the deserts economically viable. Which may be a way forward for many Arab countries, although the Moroccans are certainly ahead of it. So the Moroccans are planning actually to become net energy exporters to Europe, and it will all be green energy. So that's pretty encouraging. And you can see, if you visit some of the green mosques in Morocco, photothermal water heating they have in the outdoor areas, LED lightings, and the way in which mosque renovations and the building of new mosque is financed now in Morocco. There's special financial perks whereby it's an interest-free loan whereby the contractors build, and the contractors end up being paid from the energy savings that the mosque clocks up as a result of the successful installation of the green technologies. So it's the opposite of riba. It's just being paid from the energy savings that you make. So there is a surprising amount of good practice. There's green mosques now in Uzbekistan, for instance. There's a few in India. So it's not all negative. So this idea of taskhir, of khilafah, of responsibility for the earth, is something that the Muslim world is waking up to, I think. And in the longer term, as the regimes start to think about the next 30 or 40 years, rather than just surviving for the next year, which is how a lot of them have been thinking in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, I think we're going to see a sea change in Muslim attitudes and in the intrusion of ideas of spirituality, of custodianship towards God's earth and creation, out of the confines of the mosques and into wider society. And of course, the fact that technologies are getting cheaper all the time is really good. And it's already cheaper to use renewables in the UK than it is to import oil. So I think that even though viewers in the Gulf may furrow their brows when I say this, the future of hydrocarbons is not looking good. The oil price is going to stay very depressed, probably in the long term structurally under $20 a barrel, as these new renewables take over the world, which is a good thing, even if it might not go down terribly well in some Middle Eastern countries, but the reality is this is the way things are going to go. So it's fear, but also hope, because I do see some positive things happening in the Ummah as well.
Shaykh Abdal Hakim, thank you so much. I want to really thank you wholeheartedly for your time and for sharing with us. I can't think of a better way to conclude this series of interviews in Ramadan than with an incredibly powerful session exploring not just the fundamentals of what makes us human, but how we will continue to live and how we will survive, not just practically, but spiritually thrive as well. And I want to especially thank you for talking to us about some of the concepts of harvesting in the Quran, the idea of taskhir, as you mentioned, the idea of falah, of being people who can even imagine muflihun, imagining ourselves as harvesters, even in this age of desertification. And importantly, I think you've left us with something really tangible in the way of these incredibly interesting and hopeful examples that we may yet enliven and enrich the Islamic tradition by renewing some of these definitions and manifestations of harvesting, what it could look like in our time and place, and reviving the current climate change discourse with some really robust theological intervention. And most of all, as always, I feel like you always leave us with optimism, reminding us that no matter what the struggles of the age, the way of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is to ever be trusting in the plan and will of God. So Shaykh Abdal Hakim, may Allah continue to bless you and the work that you do. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Barakallahu feekum. And inshallah, we'll all have a good Ramadan, the last few days, inshallah. So don't forget us and CMC in your prayers, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum.
And before I say goodbye, I want to give a sincere thanks to all the guests that have joined me in this series, and also to the team at the Cambridge Muslim College for bringing us this incredible effort and making everything run so smoothly in front and behind the scenes. Dr. Zainab Kaba and Tariq Chaudhry work tirelessly to not only make everything function, but to infuse the program with a real ihsan. I also want to thank the other speakers in the Ramadan Live program, whose talks I have enjoyed and benefited from so very much. If you all have taken away as much or more as I have this Ramadan, I hope that you will sow a seed with the college and make a donation today. It's only with our support that the college can continue to grow and flourish. And finally, thank you for tuning in and sharing in these conversations. May God continue to bless the Cambridge Muslim College and everyone's Ramadan and allow us to harvest the fruits and sweetness of these last days. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.